Afternoon, everyone, and a very happy Thursday afternoon to you all, no matter where you're joining us from. Especially a warm welcome to everyone who may be joining us for one of our Thursday lunchtime lectures for the very first time. My name's George, and I work for the Church's Conservation Trust. As is always the case, the first 10 minutes of these lectures we dedicate to Church of the Week, which is where we explore one of the 356 historic churches in our care, which in some way has a link with the lecture that we're doing that week. Now, I'm really excited because today's lecture is not only from my home county of Suffolk, but it has a fascinating connection with today's lecture. So I'm going to pass you over to, not our Chief Executive today, because he's not very well, but I'm going to pass you over to Shana James, who's going to do this week's Church of the Week.
Hi, everybody. So today's Church of the Week, I'm just going to share my screen properly. George will give me the thumbs up if that's okay. Thank you, George. So yes, hello everyone. Today's Church of the Week is St Mary's Church, Redgrave in Suffolk. But first of all, I'd like to thank Ecclesiastical Insurance for sponsoring Church of the Week and for their support of the lunchtime lectures. So we have visited this church before, but we didn't have time back then to show you off all the gems. And there's a very important link between this church and today's subject of the lecture. So that's why we've chosen this church. St Mary's was built in the mid-14th century, probably on the site of the Saxon church mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086. It was built by the abbots of the Benedictine Abbey of St Edmundsbury. The abbots of Bury were lords of the manor of Redgrave until the Reformation, and Cardinal Thomas Wolsey of Wolf Hall fame was rector here in 1506. The name Redgrave is derived from the Anglo-Saxon meaning reed ditch, and Saxon pottery has been found in a field near the church. St Mary's found its way into the care of the Church's Conservation Trust on the 1st of October 2005, having been declared pastorally redundant by the Church of England. As you can see here, we embarked on a significant programme of repair and conservation work to make the building weatherproof, including a restoration of the glass in the east window, which you can see undergoing here, and repairs to the pinnacles of the tower outside. Here you can see the view looking across the nave towards the north aisle. I should point out that St Mary's is a beautiful church to come inside and take photos as the light is majestic. What you can see here is the church's fine decorated octagonal font, which dates to the 14th century. 8 heads are carved on it, and there's an interesting side note. I've been told that the font fell out of use in the middle of the 19th century, and a common slot basin was substituted instead for the sacrament of holy baptism. So I'm glad to see that the original font has been reinstated here. So very excitingly, during conservation work, and this does happen quite a lot in historic churches, part of a medieval wall painting was discovered on the north wall of the aisle, which may be contemporary with the church. So you can see bits of that here. The painting depicts a man's torso and leg, and our conservation team have conserved and protected it and consolidated it. So we think it is contemporary with the church. The east window, which I mentioned earlier, is a treat to see with these jewel-like colours, which are showed off really nicely here in this picture, and intricate tracery. The stained glass was given by E.P. Blake in 1853 and was made in Diss nearby. Like many churches, St Mary's has its fair share of monuments. And what sets this church apart is the quality of them. And I'm now going to show you 2 of them. What you see here are the effigies of Sir Nicholas Bacon, Premier Baronet of James I and his wife Anne. Sir Nicholas had the chest tomb itself built for his wife in 1616. The tomb was made by Bernard Jansen, the king's engineer. After Sir Nicholas's death in 1624, his son Edmund Bacon commissioned Nicholas Stone, later to become royal stonemason, to carve the effigies of both his parents in white marble to be placed on the tomb at a cost of £200, which is quite a lot back then. So just take a moment to admire the beauty of the stonework here. And you can see, I love this picture, you can see the jewellery and the delicate lace work on Lady Alice's collar and cuff. Finally, on to why we had to revisit Redgrave today and the link to today's lecture. In the chancel here lies the body and monument of Lord Chief Justice Sir John Holt. You can see in the picture here. You can see this is a very fine monument carved in marble by Thomas Green of Camberwell. It depicts Sir John in his judicial robes with figures of justice and mercy, which you can see here on either side, and is said to have cost £1,500. In 1645, no fewer than 18 witches, 16 women and 2 men were hanged at Bury St Edmunds under the supervision of Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general. During early 15th and late 16th centuries, hundreds of people were brutally executed in England for witchcraft. The legal framework used for the witch trials at Bury St Edmunds would be adopted and used in the infamous witch trials in Salem. During the last witch trial at Bury St Edmunds in 1694, Lord Chief Justice Sir John Holt intervened to force the acquittal of Mother Munnings of Hartis on charges of prophesying and causing death. He would intervene to acquit a further 10 cases. He was sceptical of evidence, the evidence being submitted at the time, things that included marks, familiars, maleficum, spitting pins, hereditary guilt and possession. He also prosecuted and imprisoned people who made false allegations. So he had quite a modern view of this at the time. And it's said that Holt did more than any other man in English history to end the prosecution of witches. He died on March the 5th in 1710. And that, everyone, is today's Church of the Week. George, back to you.
Thank you so much, Shana, and I hope everyone's enjoyed visiting St Mary's Redgrave. If you haven't been before, I do highly recommend that you go and give it a visit. There's quite a few CCT churches around there. You can go to Stanton. Sapperston is also not too far. That's about 7 miles away from Redgrave, but do go and have a look at it because it's a majestic church. Now, as is always the case, we normally spend a bit of time just asking Shana a couple of questions. So, Shana, we've got a couple of minutes. So I know you've been quite busy this week on books and obviously today's book. So did you want to tell everyone how they can get hold of today's book?
Yes, well, one of our lecture elves is about to post a link in the chat on Facebook, but John might be able to hold one up for you. I've actually sent all mine out because they've been so popular. So popular. I've sold all my copies, and George is going into the office tomorrow, so you can still order your book, which is the subject of today's lecture, which is absolutely fantastic. I've started reading it myself. So yes, I've sold my lot, and George is going to go and do his bit, posting the rest tomorrow. So yes, it's a fantastic book, and the link is in the chat now.
Thanks so much, Shana. And everyone, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today, especially if you're joining us for the first time. If you are joining us for the first time, please do let us know. And everyone, let us know where you're watching from today. It's quite chilly. I've had to put my jumper today. Autumn's definitely here in Tottenham. But everyone, I hope you're having nice weather wherever you are joining us from. Now, if you are joining us for the first time, just to let you know, these lectures are always completely free of charge. So if you see anyone posting links telling you can watch the lectures elsewhere, and particularly if those sites ask for credit card details, please, firstly, don't click those links, but never give out your card details. Our lectures are always free of charge. We record them, and those are also available freely for you to watch on demand on either YouTube or on Facebook. There will be another way that you can catch up on those, which we'll be letting you know about in a few weeks, because it's quite exciting. But we'll be letting everyone know about that in a couple of weeks' time. Now, I'm really excited about today's lecture, but as always, we say they're free of charge. But if you'd like to show your support, there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can, if you've got your mobile phone with you, please do make sure you like CCT, do follow us to hear about conservation work, but also to hear about upcoming lectures and talks. But also, if you've got a mobile phone, you can text donate. So if you text CCT to 70331, that will give us a gift of £3. But if you visit our website, which is www.visitchurches.org.uk, you can donate any amount that you would wish to do. Finally, if you'd like to become a member of the Trust, and membership entitles you to quite a few benefits, so invites to special tours of churches, you get a fantastic members magazine called Pinnacle, which was featured, I think it was in the Times just at last weekend. So they will talk about our members magazine Pinnacle. You'll get that a couple of times a year, but as well as that, we've got an exclusive member lecture series which started earlier this year, and the next one of those, I'm really excited to say, is on Monday, and it's on a bit of a strange topic. Monday's members lecture. It's on the subject of this book, An Irreverent Curiosity, and it's about a certain relic of Jesus that went missing from an Italian town. Look on our website because it's a fascinating lecture that's coming up for members. But also, if you join us as a member by direct debit and use the offer code LECTURE, and membership starts from just £3.50, you'll be sent a free copy of this book, which is decoding the sacred language of Christianity's sacred buildings, so churches and cathedrals. And it's a great companion to all of our lectures because it talks about everything that our lectures cover. So we've got about mosaics, we've got about stained glass, we've got about frescoes. It covers them all. And I know a lot of people have really appreciated this book. So if you've got this already, do let everyone know how great a book it is. And do let me know what your favourite part is, because we're now in the planning stage for next year, and we're going to be making lots of videos hopefully next year. So it'd be nice to know what you think you'd like to learn more about. But as Shana said there earlier on, that we are selling today's book, which launched only today. So it's a book launch we've got on today. We're selling it for the special price of just £20. Now, if you go onto a certain online retailer, whose name I shall not mention, it is selling for £25. So we're selling it £5 cheaper. So it's £20 plus postage packaging, but all the money from selling the books with us and the proceeds goes directly to helping us conserve historic churches across England. Now, if you are joining us for the first time, a great perk of these lectures is that the chat feed is always running. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask our lecturer, John, at the end, please do comment away. And we've got normally about 10 to 15 minutes at the end where we'll ask your questions. So do, please, everyone, comment away. But if you've got any technical issues, any problems with the sound, video, comment away, and either myself or one of my team will be in touch with you and try and help you resolve those problems. But I'm going to pass you now back to Shana, who's going to introduce today's guest lecturer.
Thank you, George, and thanks for that. By the way, I really like your new glasses. Very nice. So thank you, Major. I'm now going to introduce our lecturer. John Callow is an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Suffolk. He has written widely on early modern witchcraft, politics, and popular culture. He is the author of King in Exile, James II, and Embracing the Darkness, A Cultural History of Witchcraft, and co-author with Professor Geoffrey Scarre of Witchcraft and Magic in 16th and 17th century Europe. He's appeared on BBC Radio 4 documentary It Must Be Witchcraft and the series on Salem Witches on the Discovery Channel in the USA. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to John.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Shana, and it's lovely to speak to you and listen to all the great work you do, and that you're taking care of the fabric of the country's history and places that have a wonderful resonance with the history and the legacy of witchcraft. And I'll come on to St Mary's and Biddeford in a little bit. But although the story of the Bideford Witches hangs to some level around that church, it's actually the only place that you can go and touch things like the font that were part of the witches' story, because everything else that they owned, or very little they did own, or that they knew of the material world, has by and large vanished. St Mary's is still there. But our story doesn't begin with a church. It starts with a bedroom. It starts with a chamber. And it all begins with a magpie, who on the 29th of June, 1682, came rasping and tapping at the window. It was a stricken house. The merchant, the shopkeeper, Thomas East Church, whose house it was, had been afflicted for some time. His sister-in-law, Grace Thomas, had taken to her bed, and the arrival of the magpie was quickly blown out of all significance. It was taken by the servants, by the women of the house, by Grace Thomas herself, by East Church's wife, to be a visitation from nothing less than the devil, a familiar spirit come to haunt and to plague them. As bad luck would have it, at the very time that the household had calmed down, the magpie had flown around the chamber, scared everybody, finally been driven out. At the very time that the household gets back to order, they hear something just outside the door, just outside the front window of the house. They fling the windows and the doors open, and they see before them an old beggar woman, Temperance Lloyd, whose image is here. More of this image in a second. And very quickly, within the next 24 hours, Lloyd's personality, her presence, eavesdropping on their conversations, become conflated with the magpie. The something, as the trial extracts say, in the shape of a bird, meaning, as I said before, the devil or one of his demons himself. And within less than 2 months, this series of accidents, for accidents they were and coincidences, led Temperance and 2 of her acquaintances, we can't call them friends because there's very little to actually link their lives other than grinding poverty. Within 2 months, all 3 would end up hanging at the gallows just outside Exeter, having been convicted of the crime of witchcraft and executed for their crimes. So we can ask ourselves a number of questions. Why this case came so late in the history of English witchcraft? After all, these are the 3 women that we know for sure who were the last to be hanged for the crime. How we can recover their voices. What you really need to know, I think, about this first image is the fact it represents a stock image. It's not a portrait of Temperance Lloyd. It's highly unlikely that she ever had the money to dress herself in anything like the finery that's given here. But it was thought by a London printer to represent her near enough. And this is one of the problems, that the witches rarely speak for themselves, in the same way that the poor rarely speak for themselves in early modern England. But we can recapture their story and something of what they said, from what they said at the gallows, what they said at the trial, what they said to their accusers, and what was said about them. We've got to be careful because, of course, this was filtered and they got anything but a fair deal, which we'll talk about later. But nevertheless, we can recover something. The problems with evidence, though, are rooted in images like this. We simply don't know what they look like. We have trouble reconstructing the conventional biography of these women. But we can get there. We can get more right, I think, than we can get wrong. So a little bit about the 3 women themselves. Temperance Lloyd, pictured here, was a Welsh immigrant who'd come to Biddeford, a prosperous Atlantic port, at the end of the civil wars with her husband. She was abandoned about the time of the Restoration, and from 1664 onwards, she's on parish relief. We know this, and you'll see an image of it later, from the wonderful survivals in the dole book for one of the charities operating in the town. And it was that linked her. Literally, you see their names after each other recorded for the monies that were handed out to them on the dole days, with her 2 colleagues in misfortune, Susanna Edwards, who was the only one of the women who was from Biddeford. She was born illegitimate. The link with the church, the palpable one, is that we know she was baptized in the font there. And she, in a way, had the furthest to fall. She had kith and kin in the town. She came from an established family of some means. But rather like Temperance Lloyd, she was very quickly abandoned by the menfolk about her. She lost a number of her children to the plague that ravaged the port just after the Civil War, and found herself on relief as well. The third of the women, Mary Trembles, in a way is the most silent. We know less about her. She rarely spoke for herself and seems to be one of those people who was just unfortunate in every sense of the word. She may have been an Irish immigrant. Her parents were poverty-stricken migrants who came to Biddeford slightly later in the 1670s. She was an unmarried daughter. So you can get from the very beginning the fact that these 3 women were marginal in every sense of the word in 17th century society. They were marginal in terms of their gender. They were women at a time of a patriarchal society where women were very much seen as being the weaker vessels. They were marginal in terms of their age. They were all getting on in years. They're not, though, as old as the people who commented on their cases suggested. The judge and his brother thought that certainly Temperance Lloyd was approaching her 70s, if not older, when in actual fact, as far as I can best work out from the evidence, she was probably in her early 60s, but a life of grinding poverty and want had obviously destroyed her looks and her frame. They were marginal as well in terms of their marital status. None of these women had any man to protect them and any family to protect them. And in fact, the root tragedy of the case is that if one single person at any point in the last 2 months of their life had spoken up for them, the charges would have probably been dropped, as happened with other women that we'll come on to in the same case, because there were actually 5 Bideford witches, not 3, but 3 were convicted. And the fact that these 3 were absolutely friendless certainly didn't help their cause. The other sense of marginality, and it's an incredibly significant one when we look at the Bideford case, comes in terms of their poverty. These people are abjectly poor. When they're accused of image magic, one of the exhibits used against them is a scrap of leather that has pinpricks in them. Now, that was thought to produce the shooting pains and the pricks that Grace Thomas felt in her chamber at the merchant's house. But in actual fact, if you think about it, if you raid somebody's hovel and that's all you can find that these women had, it tells you something about their lack of wealth and the fact that they are in a state of absolute poverty. We know that they scavenged the fields, they scavenged outside people's homes for scraps, bits of tobacco, they gathered broom from the fields, and they used the common bakehouse. So they didn't even have their own hearth to cook upon. So life had treated them pretty awfully, but life had treated them pretty awfully in an environment that was characterized by growing wealth and a growing gulf between the rich and poor. So George, if we could have the next slide, please. There we go. There we've got the 3 witches from a modern mural, which gives you the view of the idea that they are Shakespeare's witches in effect, with all the cliches, the dark robes, again their agedness, and also the sugarloaf hats that are synonymous with witchcraft, which actually were the common garb of country women across, well, certainly for the first 2/3 of the 17th century. So that hat is associated with old country women, because as things go out of fashion, the old tend to carry on wearing the fashions of their youth, the young tend to wear their own stuff. So you've got the, if you like, the cliched image of the witches here, which really doesn't bear a great deal of relationship to how the women were. There is an idea that the 3 women were a kind of coven, that they hung together, that they were great friends, and you find this in the novels and radio plays and in the mural that's been painted on the wall at Exeter near to the site of their execution. But in actual fact, there's nothing to suggest that the 3 women had anything more than a nodding acquaintance. There's circumstantial evidence that Susanna Edwards and Mary Trembles may have gone around begging together. Obviously, for reasons of safety, women who begged then as now went around in pairs very often, or even in threesomes for protection. Nobody wanted a common assault. But what comes through, I think, very clearly is that Temperance Lloyd was on her own. She was seen as the dominant of the 3 women, the chief witch, as one of the pamphlets thunders against her, and that Edwards and Trembles had an uneasy friendship that turned into very bitter recrimination as they dragged each other down and accused each other of all sorts. So if we could have the next slide, please, George. Here we go. And now, and all this happens in Biddeford. This is the best image we have of 17th century Biddeford, and a player in these events. The portrait is of John Strange. It's an absolutely wonderful pictogram, really, of the guy's life, and it's at Biddeford Museum now and Gallery, and is well worth a visit if you're down in Devon or the West Country. Biddeford hasn't really outgrown its 17th century boundaries. It was an Atlantic boom town at the time of the witches. Most of the tobacco rushing into England in the close of the 17th century from the Americas came through Biddeford. Bristol still hadn't eclipsed it, London still hadn't eclipsed it. Liverpool still hadn't got its act together till about 30 years later. So it was a time of enormous expansion, enormous wealth. So they have the cod fisheries, they have a maritime culture. In a way that I think is hard for us to understand today, the sailors and the citizens of Bideford had far more in common with the people in the American colonies up the Chesapeake River from which they traded than they actually would have in, say, Plymouth or the remoter parts of their own county. But we forget that the sea lanes were major arteries of trade long before Marshal Wade found a way of recreating or creating modern roads after the Roman model at the beginning of the 18th century. So you can see here we have Bideford before it was redeveloped under the pressures of new money, and a lot of the buildings were cleared at the beginning of the 18th century. So you've got the things that defined it and defined the witches' world. You've got the ship being towed out, probably on voyage to the Atlantic or having just loaded tobacco. At the right of the image, if you can see it as you look at it, there's the long bridge that then had a chapel at each end that was used actually as the town jail by then after the Reformation, that was lit at night so ships wouldn't run into it, and that spanned the enormous reaches of the Torridge, the tidal river that gave Bideford its wealth. You can see over Strange's shoulder a long line of warehouses, and again the tobacco hogsheads were offloaded here and stacked up on the port, and that's integral to the story of the witches. They begged for tobacco, they went door to door, the cargoes loaded up onto the jetty spilled over, creating this state where pigs were running riot, all kinds of creatures, all kinds of feral cats were rooting in and out of them. And in the common imagination, these animals about their business became associated with the witches. The witches were scavenging door to door. Well, these little animals were scavenging door to door. And again, as happened with the magpie, the two got associated and conflated. Well, maybe it's not just a pig or a cat that's ransacking the scraps along the quayside. Maybe it's actually the witches in animal form. The other thing to say about this is that the portrait itself, I think, tells us an awful lot about the mind of the 17th century. Those of you who are particularly eagle-eyed will have spotted already the dirty great arrow sticking out of Strange's head, which is kind of an odd thing to put in a portrait at the best of times. But the portrait is there to serve as really a vision of God's providence, that Strange was a merchant from an Anglo-Irish family, made his money on the tobacco trade, was the hero of the plague in Biddeford just after the Civil War. He was the mayor who held everything together and died thereof. But the remarkable providences, God's mercy as he saw acting out of his life, were ventured by the fact that, as you can see in the left corner, he fell off a cliff, was a boy while birds nesting, but survived that. He was shot in the head with an arrow, but he survived that. And he was mugged going across the Long Bridge on the right-hand side and thrown into the Torridge, but survived that. Strange, rather than thinking, heck, I'm really unlucky and somebody's got it in for me, didn't concentrate on that. He concentrated as a good Calvinist on the idea that God was protecting him from all of this. You can see as well the idea he's holding the globe. Literally, he's got the world in his hands. And this again reflects his status, his wealth, the fact that Bideford is a bustling, busy place with lots of money and the new good things that are coming into society around about this time after the end of the civil wars. Hot chocolate, coffee, tobacco, all those kinds of things. Thing to remember, we don't have the slave trade yet, fortunately. Bristol hasn't become yet a slaving port. So one of the things that wasn't conveyanced out of Biddeford at any time was slaves. It wasn't conveyanced later because Biddeford dies as an Atlantic port by the time the English slave trade is actually getting going. So Strange is somebody who may well, he would have known Temperance Lloyd. He would have seen her in the streets. He would have known Susanna Edwards, so he knows 2 out of the 3 witches. But we have a sense in this picture of God acting in the everyday. God is an immanent God, by which we mean that he intervenes in human affairs. This is the Old Testament God who throws around thunderbolts if he doesn't like you. And this is incredibly important, I think, to get into the mindset that produced witch hunts, and this idea that there's a daily struggle going on between God and the devil. And this becomes more and more pronounced as the 17th century goes on, and then burns itself out by the end of that century, which we'll come to when we discuss John Holt at the end. Can we have the next slide, please, George? There we go. But Biddeford, despite its wealth, despite its prosperity, despite things getting better, is a really troubled place. It's troubled because people like Strange, who would run the show for the best part of 50 years, are suddenly displaced by the Restoration, the resettlement of church government, the return of the bishops, the episcopacy, the formalisation of the Church of England that, of course, caused the split in 1662 with the Congregationalists and the Baptists and the Dissenters going off. So the former top dogs, the natural leaders of Biddeford, who should have been there in 1682, aren't. They've all been driven underground, and they have to, well, go to illegal services, hear illegal preachers, like the Bartletts, father and son, who had been in the living, who had been the elder, William Bartlett, had been the vicar at St. Mary's in Biddeford, but he's literally driven underground and hunted as a fugitive. This marvellous print by Laroon, it's fascinating on loads of different levels, but it's attacking the dissenters. So you've got all kinds of things. You can see below the makeshift pulpit, Titus Oates popping his head up. Again, the sugarloaf hats of the witch figures, the little boys not listening, the woman squatting down on the right-hand corner, pleasuring herself because she's bored with the sermon. And it's a satire. It's a satire suggesting witchcraft, because these people are seen just like the witches as being agents of a foreign power. And all those things you hear about witches, licentiousness, bawdiness, double dealing, putting on one view in public and another in private, are being levelled at the dissenters here. The thing about Biddeford is that nobody is actually where they're supposed to be, or actually who they're supposed to be. And this is one of the reasons the three women of Biddeford ended up on trial for their lives. The simple fact is that you had an absentee lord. The Earl of Bath was at court with Charles II. He wasn't watching the family manor in the way that his father and grandfather had. The natural religious leaders of the town, the Bartletts, were on the run from the government, preaching in barns like this, getting arrested multiple amounts of times and dragged off to Exeter and escaping. The man who got Ogleby, the man who got the settlement, the living of the parish from the Earl of Bath, was disastrous. He had a ready wit, he liked drinking, he fell out with absolutely everybody. So at the moment when somebody could have put a restraining hand and stopped the persecutions and pulled in the accusations, nobody actually wanted to, and that the port was split between the Tories, who were Church of England, who now had control of the town hall and forward the prosecutions, and the dissenters or the Whigs who'd lost their positions, lost a lot of their money, were fined for their faith and were driven underground. So it's a powder keg. And if you think it's only 3 years away that we have the Monmouth Rising, Monmouth's agents are in and out of Biddeford every 5 minutes. The police organisation, the government's agents are always watching it. So along with the tobacco kegs, we have a powder keg of politics sitting there in this little Devon town. Okay, next slide. There we go. I'm very grateful for Peter Christie letting me have this from his collection. He's a wonderful local historian in Biddeford. And this is Gunstone Lane in Biddeford. And basically, it hasn't changed that much from the time of the witches. The roofs would have been thatched rather than tiled. You can see the the Edwardian kids at the top of the slope, but this is to give you an idea that Biddeford, its geography is key to the story. It's incredibly steep, and it's in this place on Gunstone Lane that Temperance Lloyd claims to have met the devil. She was coming back with the broom over her shoulders, and she talks about meeting a gentleman all in black who came to take her load. So you have a view, even today, when you try and climb Gunstone Lane, it is a steep climb. It's a really steep climb. You're out of breath on your way to the little art centre if you're not lucky. And you can imagine, for an elderly woman under a load, this was symptomatic of her role in life and the troubles that were afflicting her. So the devil comes into the story very early on. In the first testimonies, like a lot of witchcraft trials, Temperance Lloyd doesn't really talk about the devil. She talks about a thing that's taken to be a familiar spirit. Looks a bit like a toad gambling in front of her, again on Gunstone Lane, sort of almost doing cartwheels. And you think to yourself, well, is this simply the product of the decay of her eyesight? If you've got cataracts, light reflects in different ways. There are all kinds of tricks. But also it's this feature that is completely unique to English witchcraft trials of the idea of the familiar spirit, the idea of the little animal that comes and predominates in a lot of the court records. So very quickly in the minds of her persecutors, again, the animal form is taken to be synonymous with the devil. How do these women get tarred with a brush of being literally agents of Satan? Well, their poverty marks them out. Their incessant begging marks them out. So as you can see from the image on the right, the old woman with the basket of apples looking like a Walt Disney Black Queen turned Wicked Witch proffering the poisoned apple to Snow White. Temperance Lloyd's problems came over a long period of time. She's first accused of witchcraft in 1671. That's 11 years before she goes to the gallows. She's accused again in 1679 and then finally in 1682. She's accused of killing a small-scale farmer, a guy called Herbert. She's accused of killing a child by cursing. And what happened was one day, not very far from Gunstone Lane, or possibly on Gunstone Lane itself, a young mother and a child were about their business. Temperance Lloyd, for once in her life, had fallen lucky in the fact that she'd managed to beg, borrow, or glean a basket full of apples, and she was trying to sell these for a sustenance to make a living. The child stole one, ran off with it happily, and Temperance Lloyd followed mother and child up the street, asking to be paid for it. To the wealthy young mother, it seemed like a joke. To Temperance Lloyd, who had nothing else to sell, it was far from a joke. And when she was shoved away, told to go away, told not, that it was a child's jape and not to expect money for it, for a gift, she fell to cursing. And if we think about it, and of course the child fell sick within a matter of days, the bloom of her cheeks fell away, and she was buried within the week, and the two things become associated. So if we think about that power to curse, if we think about the way it grows in people's minds, if we think about the operation of charity, you can maybe relate it to your own lives today. How many times have we all passed some unfortunate person selling the big issue in any urban centre? And naturally, I think you have a feel of guilt. You'd want to give to every person on the street begging if you could, but you know damn well that if you gave everybody £1, I'm afraid to say, you'd join them in the gutter very, very quickly. If you take that feeling of guilt and think, as you ignore that person, that they mumble something just out of earshot, it can be quite upsetting, or it can throw you off your stride for a minute or two. What did they say? Was it a curse? What was it they were trying to tell you? And this thought can grow like a little earworm and expand and expand and expand. And this is precisely what happened in the case of Temperance Lloyd, that she was at best socially maladroit. When she meets Grace Thomas, the woman she'd frightened earlier by appearing outside the house when Grace Thomas had got a little bit better and was able to go out to take the night air. She again totally misjudges the situation. She goes over the top. She throws herself at the woman's feet and says, "How glad I am, Mistress Grace, to see you so well and hearty." And what she's trying to do is be nice and maybe get a penny for her commiserations, for her care. Unfortunately, because she stinks, because she's particularly ugly and worn, because her attempt to be friendly comes across as pushy and violent, Grace Thomas gets frightened and again associates the act of the woman commiserating with somehow secret knowledge and with a threat. So these things begin to grow and grow and grow. So when a child's doll appears on Grace Thomas's bed, this is a childless woman, it's not that a stray animal maybe brought it in, that a kid left it from the shop downstairs, any one of 100 other rational explanations. It's this was image magic. This was a puppet or a mummet that was used for pinpricks to desire her misfortune and her death through the devil's art. So we've got all the ingredients beginning in Biddeford for the classic witch case. We've got curses, we've got image magic through the puppet, and the little bit of leather with the pin pricks, and bearing in mind Grace Thomas always says she felt really bad pins and needles when her pains came. We've got the appearance of the devil, which is quickly extracted out of them through the appearance of black gentlemen. We also have counter magic, that the first thing the accusers do to Temperance Lloyd is they try and scratch her. They try and lure her back into the house and perpetrate a common assault to draw blood on her. Now, the idea was, once you drew blood off the witch who'd hurt you, that basically they lost the power to harm. And again, that is botched. It all goes wrong. Ironically, had they been able to do that, maybe the charges would have ceased. Who knows? But these things did have a kind of life of their own. So they become the talk of the town very rapidly. And this is accentuated by the role of the physicians and the apothecaries, because when people go to them who claim to be afflicted in ever greater numbers, often with things, in the case of the death of another child, in the case of something that was quite obviously smallpox, the physicians tend to say, "Have you thought about witchcraft?" And it seems to be that the people who were appealing to them actually hadn't before it was suggested. But the apothecaries, the physicians, are people in authority. And again, it grows. Witchcraft is not an irrational belief at this period. We have this idea that, anybody screams witches is somehow looking back to the medieval period when they didn't, by and large, hunt witches, unless you were Joan of Arc. But in actual fact, it's a product of early modernity. It's a product of modernity, and it's a product of reading and learning. Because if you think about the kinds of things people would have read as their core texts in the 17th century, what they have had, they would have had the Bible, where there are witches, the injunction in Leviticus, as translated by the King James Version, "Thou shalt not let a witch to live." They'd have known about Saul going to see the witch of Endor. They'd have known about Moses confronting Pharaoh's magicians, the magic contest with them where he turns their staves into snakes, etc., etc. They would have had classical sources that, again, from Medea onwards, talk about witches as being embodied as part of the fabric of their society. You'd have had King James's book on demonology, which again proves or attempts to prove through a highly intellectual argument the actual reality of witchcraft. So if you deny witches, and this was one of the arguments being used against people like John Holt, who were trying to dispel witch belief, if you refuse to believe in witches, you're going against the literal truth of the Bible. And when we begin that, who knows where we end? That was continually the argument. put forward in particular in this period by a guy called Glanville in his books, where he was saying, if you let witch belief drop, very soon you will get atheism on a sliding slope, because we don't know what's next. We'll lose the immanent God. And this is one of the things that drove the trials on. So the witches conform to the standard stereotypes. So George, come over the next picture, please. There we go. Here's, just backtracking a little bit, here's the doll book for 1681. So this is exactly a year. It's a wonderful survival in Biddeford. And the John Andrew doll still survives, but this gives you the list of the poor. And a lot of the stuff for the biography of the three women I've attempted in my book comes out of the doll payments, because this is the only way we can reconstruct these people's lives and something about them. It's an incredible source for this period in the town, and chronicling poverty, those very people who were just denied a voice, very often at the time they were living and also in later life. Fascinating thing about this entry is that the three women's names, you can't quite see it here, but the three women's names appear one after the other. So they would have lined up in Dole's house, in John Andrew's house rather, to receive the doll. So you actually have this snapshot about a year before they died of the three of them all there together, being ushered in by the wardens and given their pennies and heading out, and that idea of their relief and marginality. And as you can see from the number of names there, Biddeford may have been very rich, but it had a large number of poor. There were never less than 50 plus people claiming relief in the period we're looking at. Okay, next image, please. Right, we'll move on to Holt in a second. So we have the women very quickly arrested. The allegations spread. They spread to other women, Mary Beer and Elizabeth Caddy, who were also accused of witchcraft. Depositions are taken at the town hall in front of the mayor and the aldermen and the justices of the peace, who consider there is a case to argue. And there is the sense that there is literally, as on the front cover of the book, there is a baying mob at the heels of these old women that have been stirred up against them. They're literally run in. And I think one of the motors that caused local government to act in the way it did was fear of the whole thing spinning out of control, that witch hunters were brought into Biddeford. They were hired by the families of the women who were held to be possessed by the witches. And I think in some respects, the justices of the peace are acting so that justice doesn't get completely privatized. It isn't meted out in rough form upon the streets. They intend to get the women out of the locality as quickly as possible. I'm not entirely convinced they even desired their deaths. Temperance Lloyd had gone to trial twice before, and she'd got off on both occasions at Exeter. So I think the idea of you're removing troubled people who were the focuses of discontent is the first thing on the local authorities' minds, but they certainly don't give the women a lifeline, in contrast to what they do to Mary Beer and Elizabeth Caddy, who are also accused. What's different in this case? What's different in this case is that these two women are married, they have families, and they have money. They can afford to mount a defence. They have people who will speak for them. And in complete contrast to what happens to the Bideford Three, the Bideford Two are not arrested. They're allowed to remain at large. And when it comes to the pre-trial horse trading that goes on at Exeter, the Bideford justices of the peace speak up for them, whereas they're quite happy to clear the prosecutions of the three poor women. So justice is tempered by how much money you've got. The trial goes incredibly bad. Well, it couldn't go any worse for the three women, but I think it's worth thinking about what actually happens at Exeter. We have an idea of a legal system today that has fortunately been informed by people like Sir John Holt, as you see in his marvellous funerary monument in the church, who actually established a rule of law that was aimed to be blind, aimed to be there for everybody, regardless of their status. It doesn't really kind of work like that in the 1680s. The 1680s are the kind of tipping point from one period to the other. Bear in mind the Chief Justice in the 1680s is hanging Judge Geoffreys of notorious fame. So when the women go through, if you look at the surviving records of the 1679 trial for Temperance Lloyd, it was probably over in 5 or 10 minutes. It was machine justice. They were pushing large numbers of people in through the assizes, and considerations of the cases were fairly brisk. It wasn't the idea that days would be taken and juries would go out for hours and hours to consider. It was a fairly sort of short, sharp shock of an experience for women out of their familiar circumstances, bearing in mind they'd been held in the dungeons below Exeter Castle, brought up into the bright lights and questioned by people who were by far their social superiors. And the danger in those situations is that you want to please the very people who are accusing you, and that can rapidly become absolutely fatal. It does in this case. Nobody speaks for them, and they make the mistake that Temperance Lloyd doesn't do in her previous 2 arraignments. They admit everything. They don't quite do it in the way that the justices demand, but they don't deny what was happening. Worse still, the mob is stirred up against them. When the 2 judges, Raymond and North, ride into Exeter in their carriage, the carriages stop and won't go any further than the drawbridge of the castle. And the mob gets in their head that the witches had been able to magic or charm the horses so they wouldn't take a step further, so that the trials would be cancelled. So the mob are against them. Raymond, the judge, who is cast perhaps a little unkindly as a timorous man by his fellow judge, Lord North, who leaves the account, has no choice. Well, you know, they've admitted to it. Witchcraft is on the statute book as something that is a criminal offence, so he finds them guilty. Herein lies the rub at the end of our talk. We have as one of the key texts for the lives of the Bideford Witches, Lord North's letter to the Secretary of State in London. This is normally where you could bargain for a pardon. It wasn't a done deal. These women could have been reprieved. Reprieves were being used all the time in the West Country and other places in England in the late 17th century. Why doesn't it happen? It doesn't happen because the government of Charles II are scared of losing control of the West Country to the radical opposition. They're scared of a revolution. North spins it that if you throw these people to the whims of the mob won't trouble you in other areas. So it's a deeply duplicitous letter that he actually writes, saying, well, I don't believe in witchcraft myself, but I think for the good of the state, these women have to hang. So it's an exercise in pretty hideous realpolitik. He also defines them as saying if a painter wanted to draw a witch or paint a witch, they would have no better examples in the whole of England for one to actually envisage old, decrepit, mindless women, as he styles them, who are utterly garrulous. So it's a cynical, shocking end to these 3 women's lives. They hang on the 25th of August 1682 at the appropriately named Heavy Tree. But from their arrival on the scaffold, and we have a little pen portrait of Temperance Lloyd guilelessly munching on an apple, another apple, on the cart on the way to execution, as if she was untroubled, trying to fill her stomach that had rarely been filled in life. At the moment they get to the gallows, their story starts to turn. They're berated by one of the ministers, who, and possibly the guy was a witch hunter, a guy called the Reverend Francis Han. He tries to make a name for himself. He tries to get his story out in the pamphlet literature, and it all goes wrong for him. And it all goes wrong for him. The reasons we don't know Han's name, like we know Matthew Hopkins or John Stern, is because the witches at this point don't give the confessions he was trying to extort out of them. Well, we didn't kill that child. We may have cursed. We didn't do it that way. We didn't raise storms. We don't know anything about a boy from falling out the rigging of a ship. etc., etc., etc. So it's bungled and the crowd get unsettled. I don't think for a minute that they thought they were guiltless, but Han doesn't have the triumph over the women in death that he might otherwise have had. And certainly in Susanna Edwards's choice of final psalm, that is incredibly reflexive and poignant if she actually did choose that psalm for herself, but we're told she did. The beginnings of the women's rehabilitation come about. As you heard from Chana at the beginning, and this has been, I'm afraid, for a lunchtime in the run-up to Halloween, a fairly grim tale of poverty, want, unfairness, and a savage, undeserved death. What you do get, and actually the persecution of women by men, the pleasant sting in the tail comes from the career of Sir John Holt, that within a few years, Holt, who was an opponent of slavery, he stopped slavery spreading to England. He makes a landmark ruling that a young lad who jumped ship in London couldn't be sold or returned to his master. He says, you can have slavery in America, that's fine, but the moment an African sets foot in England, he's a free man, let the guy go. So that's one thing. He hates the standing army of James II. He loathes professional soldiers. And thirdly, he is deeply skeptical about witchcraft. What's Holt's achievement? Well, he doesn't overturn the witchcraft statutes, but what he does do, because he's bound by them, this is basically the problem. They are law, so there is a case to answer. But what he does is he says the evidence against these women is fraudulent. So in the case of a wonderfully named woman called Susanna Morduck or Mordyke on the south bank of London, he has her accuser arrested and actually flogged at the pillory for telling lies and feigning possession. So the whole balance of evidence shifts within about 20 years. It's no longer for the women to prove their innocence, it's for the accusers to prove their guilt. And it is a dramatic shift in the world. And if we can have our penultimate slide now, please, George. And we see this shift. This is another portrait from Biddeford. This is John Abbott, who was a plasterer. And the shift and the decisive thing that means that today, thank goodness, we live in a society informed by the Western Enlightenment. The great shift that happens is in the change in the way that women and men see God himself over the course of the 17th century. That by the end of the century, God is less and less immanent. He's transcendent. He's the watchmaker, the divine watchmaker who sits outside human affairs as the designer. And you can see it, I think, the two portraits I showed you, the one of John Strange at the beginning, the pictogram, all his life told in Calvinistic providences, is separated by this image of Abbott by 40 years. But what do we have with Abbott, who again would have known the witches? He's working in Biddeford all the time. But here we've got a middle-class man, an artisan, who is sure of his profession, who is rejoicing in his art. He's holding in his hand the scalpel that was used to construct his amazing frescoes. There's one of it is his frescoes still survive, his plasterwork still survives in the church in Frifflestock, a couple of miles outside Biddeford. So the scalpel was key to him. You can see he's not wearing the heavy wig of a gentleman. He's wearing a cap. He's not trying to ape a class he doesn't belong to, but he's got enough money to celebrate his art, celebrate his achievement. And there is no sense, I think here you'll agree, of God or divine favour. That is the shift that happens from the 1660s up until the repeal of the witchcraft statute in 1735, 1736. The other key thing, and if we can have the final slide, please, George, as we run into the end, is the posthumous rehabilitation of the witches. So if you go through the gardens at Exeter Castle today, you'll come across the monument to the witches, set up by Judith Noble and a women's collective about 20 years ago now. And if you think about it, and I'll leave you with this, there can be few more transformations of reputation than that which happened to the last 3 witches to hang in England. Reviled, ignored, discarded in life, over the last 200, 300 years, they've come to be remembered and seen as archetypes, particularly the figure of the witch through women's groups after the Enlightenment and Romantic period and the first and second wave of feminism. They've come to be seen in very different ways in our contemporary society. They're not something to be reviled. The rags, the opprobrium, the hatred has all fallen away to reveal, I think, increasingly a vision of womanhood, an emancipated womanhood that is empowering. The witch figure has totally changed, I think, certainly since the late 60s, early 70s, into something totally different. And if their shades are looking upon us, I think there can be few sweeter posthumous revenges that when the names of the judges who sent them to execution, the names of those in the mob who decried them, the names of the local justices of the peace and mayor at Biddeford who sent them off for trial have been completely and utterly forgotten. Even the name of the Secretary of State who cleared their death warrants, I don't think is a household name today. These 3 women are memorialized in stone, and you're all listening on a rainy, or at least it's rainy up here in Lancashire, Thursday afternoon to their story and their lives, and hopefully remembering them with a sympathy and a fondness and a respect that they were denied through their lives. So I think we'll leave it there, George, and throw it open to questions.
John, thank you so much. That's been mind-blowing in so many ways. I've learned a lot, and particularly what you've just said there, I think it's very poignant, what they were denied in life, the respect and dignity that, you know, all human beings are owed and deserve was denied them, but they're finally getting that recognition and some sense of justice, which they were denied in life as well, as being given to them now. Everyone, thank you so much for your comments. Now is the time we're going to go into questions. So if you've got any questions for John, please comment away on Facebook chat, and I'll do my best to get answers for you. Just a reminder, everyone, you can buy John's book, which was published today. We'll post a link on the chat. So John's holding up a moment, but I'll let him tell you a bit more about it shortly, because there's been a couple of questions about the book. But you can buy it from us for just £20 plus postage and packaging. And as I said at the start, a certain online retailer is selling it for £25, so we're cheaper. But obviously, all the proceeds from sales of these books goes directly to helping us conserve historic churches, and indeed the monuments contained within them, such as that of John Holt. So please do consider buying from us. Now, if you join this lecture, please do consider supporting our work at the Trust. There's a couple of ways you can do that. You can text donate. So if you text CCT to 70331, that will give us a gift of £3. Or if you become a member with us from by direct debit, and if you join us using the offer code CCT, offer code lecture at the checkout, you'll get a free copy of this wonderful book. Right, there's been a lot of questions, so I'm going to jump. Now, the first question is, why does Leominster claim to be the place of the last execution of witches? Do you know?
Leinster in Ireland.
Herefordshire.
Oh, Herefordshire. Well, it's not. It's not. Sorry, I didn't quite hear the beginning. It's not. Quite simply, I mean, there are people who, there are unfortunate cases of village witchcraft that go on. Owen Davis's brilliant book about cunning folk details this in some detail. There is rough justice where women are dunked in ponds and catch pneumonia, or are beaten up and it contributes to their death. But in actual fact, Exeter is the last place where women were hanged in this country. Scotland has later cases of burnings. Scotland and Germany burn. Nobody burns in England, they're hanged. It's a common misapprehension about witches. We all think they burn. So it is Exeter, hence the plaque. Thank you so much for that answer there. I hope that answers the person's question. Second question, you mentioned about the stereotypical Halloween witch's hat being called, I think you said a sugar hat, sorry. Like a sugar loaf, yeah. Some said, is this based on the Welsh hat? And is it also possible that it makes sense because didn't one of the witches come from Wales? Well, that's a nice idea. Yeah, I mean, Temperance Lloyd was Welsh. she married a Welshman. She came from a Welsh background. She was Temperance, she was Temperance Jones before. Now the witch hat. Good point. That survival in Welsh folk costume is the last survival of that 17th century headdress. So yes, on that level, I think it's too much. The Welsh connection, everybody wore them at this point. Every old countrywoman. There's a marvellous picture by the great Cavalier artist William Dobson of an aristocratic family, and the mother there, the elderly mother looking after the kids, is wearing one of these hats. So it's not something that is specifically Welsh, and it has to be said as a shout out to Wales. The Welsh did not persecute, just like the Irish didn't, witches in the way that the English and Scots did.
That's quite a powerful point to ponder and consider on. Thank you for sharing that with us, John. And I'm trying to whiz through some of the questions, but someone said, as a medievalist, I've always wondered how witches came to be associated with the medieval period rather than the early modern. Do you know why this may have been?
Popular memory. Popular memory. The fact it's very unwelcome for us to think that the witch trials were a product of modernity, not the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were... Medieval law was incredibly skeptical about witchcraft. They didn't have those tensions in society. I mean, it's a whole other lecture, but suffice to say, what begins to turn things is the trial of Joan of Arc. It's her trial. She goes to her death at Rouen in a highly political trial, and what they get her on is being a witch and transvesticism. They say you dress as a man. This is inspired by the devil. So they get her on those two things, and it was an entirely new legal development by the University of Paris, pushed by the English crown to kill somebody who was inconvenient. So it's not a medieval thing. It's something that begins to gain ground around about the middle of the 16th century. And so for that period, about 1560 to 1660, is the real heartland of European witch persecution. I think it's just because the witch... We tend to think that everybody in the past knew less than us, and that the Middle Ages were somehow barbaric and superstitious. And it's unwelcome to say that some of the greatest minds of the 17th century believed in witches.
Thanks, John. And you talked obviously that the three women were from Biddeford. At the time of their persecution, what was the population size of Biddeford, do you think?
Gosh, that's a good one. It's hard to work out from the hearth returns. You're looking at about 8,000, perhaps a bit less, 5 to 8. But it's also conditioned by the fact that the population rises dramatically when the ships are in. So you've got a continual floating population of mariners, because a lot of the men are away on the Grand Banks up in Newfoundland, fishing for large periods of the year, or they're in Chesapeake Bay. So it's a very fluctuating population, which is another thing about the volatility in the town. So it's not an insignificant place.
And
the size of Birmingham, it's almost the size of Birmingham in the same period, pre-industrial Birmingham.
That's really interesting. Thanks, John. And someone's asked here, who accused the two who were found not guilty, and exactly what were they accused of?
Right, they were again accused by their neighbours. So they were again. I mean, one of the things is it's which there are nothing's ever black or white. There are shades of grey. The thing to remember about the Biddeford cases is you've got old, childless, unattached women accused, not always, primarily, by young, wealthy, married women of the crime. So Caddy and Beer are accused by their neighbours, but we don't know actually what they are accused of. They're accused of witchcraft, but we don't know what they're supposed to have done. And I think the evidence there, however frustrating it is because for whatever reason, the mayor and the justices of the peace were hushing that up. They didn't want them involved. So they are treated completely differently to the three poor women.
And you mentioned about the psalm being used. Someone's asked, what psalm was it?
Yeah, I've got it. I'll read a little bit of it. I'll try and find it. Excuse me while I shuffle about for a minute and find it. And hang on, I will get there. It is. it is. Sorry, it's a bigger book than you think sometimes when you're trying to find stuff. Right. So we've got the 40th Psalm, and I think that you see the rub of it is. I won't read it all, but let them be desolate for a reward of their shame, and say unto me, but I am poor and needy. Yet the Lord thinketh upon me. Thou art my help, my deliverer. Make no tarrying, O my God. Now, in that level, I mean, it's evils have compassed me about, mine iniquities have taken hold upon me, and I'm not yet able to look up, etc., etc. My heart faileth me. As you'll know, as the people listening to this will know, the Psalms are beautiful works of Hebrew poetry in any which way, shape or form. But for Susanna Edwards to choose that as bittersweet, the duality, you're persecuted, you're a sinner, but you're unjustly railed against, I think lends her a dignity and a voice that she otherwise completely lacked. And it's a good final shot for a woman who was denied a voice right up until the last couple of minutes of her life.
And I think that that's really echoed by some of the comments coming from everyone, and I hope everyone agrees with me that you're absolutely right. That's a very powerful shot for her to make as sort of her last testament. Does anyone? You mentioned about the Lord Justice John Holt. And he intervening obviously in witch trials, but also you mentioned about a slave landing who managed to jump ship in England, and he was stopped. He was declared a free man. Do we know anything about the slave? Do we know his name or what may have happened to him afterwards?
Well, we do. We've got there are the records. There is Holt's. I'm looking at it on the shelf in front of me. Actually, there's a enormous collection of Holt's legal documents called a report of the cases determined by John Holt. The trouble is, it was published by one of his pupils who didn't put all the radical case notes in, which is really annoying because he leaves out the slavery case, he leaves out the military case, he leaves out the witches. But we've got a record of it, and it was a young guy who was from, now let me try and remember so I don't get it wrong for you. I think the guy was bound, his master had estates in Virginia, and he'd been on a voyage with the master. He skips out of the port of London and tries to lose himself, and is reined in. So he's a young guy from what I remember of it. But it's a remarkable case, I think, for what it, as I said, I think in the talk, for what it stops. Because had Holt ruled in a different way, it would have been perfectly legal for plantation owners in the Americas to have had their slaves in their homes in London, to have brought them back across the Atlantic Ocean, and to have had slavery within an English context. It's no help, of course, for the millions of people who are being sandbagged and shipped out of Africa to work on those plantations. But it was the first shot across the bows in the war against slavery, and I think Holt deserves to be celebrated for it. If people are interested and I get the time and the wherewithal to do it, I think one thing I wouldn't mind doing is having a go at looking at Holt in greater detail, because he is the counterpoint of hanging Judge Jeffreys. Everything Jeffreys is, Holt is not. And I think it's worth remembering that the law under Charles II and James II had been completely and utterly politicized, completely, in ways that, again, is a subject for another day. But Holt is the first person to make English law, once again, something to be proud of.
Thanks, John. And for everyone who wasn't with us at the very start of this lecture, you will be able to catch up. But do go to the start, because we do at the start of the lecture Church of the Week, and the church that we chose this week was St Mary's Redgrave, which is where Sir John Holt is buried, and where there is a truly monumental tomb to him inside the chancel above his grave. But you'll be able to catch up on that. I'm sorry we're running past schedule, but I'm going to keep going. There's a few more questions, and I think if that's okay, John, we'll keep just whizzing through some of these. Someone's asked here, thank you so much for your talk, John. Does anyone know of the judgments passed by Archbishop Hubert Walter made in the 12th century upon witchcraft? He was Archbishop of Canterbury and a noted statesman.
Yeah. Yes. The place. Let me think. What are the sources to go and dig around there? The classic. If you want quick primers about what's happening earlier on, there is good old Ronald Hutton's book, The Witch, which is a history of fear, which is worth looking at. Sir Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic, which is a massive book, but it's just amazing cultural history. It's the sort of book that would never be written in academia today. It's a life's work and it's amazing, but it's, you know, it's about the size of a phone book. You know, it's not the sort of thing you can do in 5 minutes. Or to get a good workable understanding, although it's a little bit dated, there's Hugh Trevor Roper's little book to European witch hunts. Or you could even read mine and Jeff Scarre's study guide as well, but that would be plugging too much. But Trevor Roper, anything by Ronald Hutton, anything by Sir Keith Thomas. The early history of witchcraft is really, really difficult. It's fragmentary, and you want to know all of this stuff, but it's very hard to stitch the pieces together. I think you can sum it up by saying that in a lot of the cases where people are pulled in, from my experience in the medieval period, there is other stuff attached to the witchcraft. So where you've got the Duke of Gloucester falling, who was Henry V's younger brother, fascinating guy, Renaissance prince before the Renaissance, all this stuff. His mistress is running as a witch and his natural son is executed as well. And that's one of the early political witch trials in England. But very often witchcraft is added as the final aha, got you, when the evidence won't stretch. So earlier on, it's very often treason people are got to. They really want to get somebody for treason on a political thing, and they add witchcraft into the mix. So we don't have, the academic term for it is demonology. We don't have the intellectual basis laid for demonology or academic witch hunting in the Middle Ages the way we do after 1560, I'm afraid.
Thank you, John. And we're going to jump a couple of centuries ahead to Charles II. She talked quite interestingly about the letter where there's usually a case for pardon would be made, but that wasn't made in this case because there was a concern about the West revolt in the West Country. Do we know what Charles II's views were on witchcraft in comparison to his grandfather?
I don't believe he believed in it for a second. I mean, what we do know is, I mean, I think Charles II was cynical about absolutely everything, but you have to read Charles II, I think, as a man with a great capacity for cruelty, and he was. It's no wonder that J.M. Barrie models Captain Hook on Charles II. There's a very good reason for that. And I think the short end is if you think of Charles II as Captain Hook, you're not actually too far away from it. He was determined to make England an absolute monarchy, as Louis XIV had done for France. So he was no friend to liberty of any kind. I think he didn't say anything about witchcraft. I would be amazed if he countenanced it for a moment. James II, his brother, who was then Duke of York, was somewhat more superstitious. I mean, in typical James fashion, he has this thing. There's a debate at the Royal Society where there's some story from a rural area where it's claimed somebody's leg grew back because a poultice was stuck on them. And James approaches one of the academics, one of the fellows, and says, I don't really think it's true to you. And that shows you James's sort of, inability to think his way out of a paper bag. In terms of the earlier Stuarts, James VI and First is the witch hunter par excellence. He believes completely in witches. His book on demonology is frightening and amazing, and a very considered statement for the hunts. Ironically, by comparison, Charles I was not a witch hunter. Witchcraft prosecutions in England fall away under his reign until the advent of the Civil War. And there's very, very little witch literature published in England during Charles I's reign, when he's actually on the throne rather than fighting for his life. So the Stuarts are, the Stuarts are a mixed bag. I think rather like Charles II's famous quip about Presbyterianism or the dissenters, it's no religion for a gentleman to have. I think that probably sums up his views on witches as well.
Thanks, John. And everyone who still submits questions, I'm going to only have time, I think, for 3 more questions, but I'm going to try and merge some of the questions that have come in because some of them cover the same basis. So I think an interesting one, so for any of our younger audiences watching today, excuse Clement there, but everyone watching today, obviously Halloween's coming up. Where do we know where the origin, because you talked about the sugar hats, what about broomsticks? Where does this idea about witches and broomsticks come from?
That's a really good one. I think, well, let's do it very simply. Witchcraft is a domestic crime, okay? Poaching is rural, outdoors, and men. So if you look for a suspect for a poaching crime, you look for men with access to dogs and guns, don't you? Witchcraft is domestic because what's happening is the fruit isn't ripening, the butter won't churn, the eggs and the meat are going bad, the child has fallen sick in the cradle. So you look for women and the hearth. What are the tools that women use on their day-to-day business? If you look at the German witch hunts, very often they're shown with a bundle of keys in Cranach's paintings from the 16th century that women had about their belts. The broom is associated with women. There is the whole tradition of night flight. They go on the Sabbath, they rub an ointment on them that enables them to fly. It's also, there's no polite way of putting it, it's also a phallic symbol. You ride the broomstick, and in tarring the witch and in degrading her, and in degrading women in general, there is a terrible misogyny that sexualizes and debases even the most unlikely people. So not only is it the woman, for every stereotype there's an archetype, right? So the woman living alone with a cat and sweeping a hearth with a broomstick, that's what you see her with in her hand. There is also the idea of the wanton lascivious woman who literally rides it in quite a different way. So that's where your broomstick comes. There's loads of earlier iconography as well. In the German paintings, they ride goats, they ride all kinds of things. But the broomstick is the one that really sticks.
And going back a few centuries, because we talked about the publication of the King James Bible, and obviously the Bible being translated into vernacular, and so more people being able to openly read it. But if we go a few centuries back and look at the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches, did that have an impact on how women were treated in England?
It has a massive one. I mean, that again is the same period. Sprenger and Kramer writing that in the 1480s. So again, it's more modern than medieval, and it's there because, as you rightly say, it's published. It's not a churchman's treatise written on vellum. It's something that has a mass audience. So it comes out in Nuremberg, goes into all these. It's a product of the Renaissance, and I think Western Europe has got to get its head around that. It's a product of the new technology. The Hammer of the Witches is the famous one because it's so quotable. It's so quotable, it is so incredibly misogynistic that everybody turns to it first. Was it the most commonly used guide to a demonologist working in England? Probably not. I think if you were looking in an English setting from the Renaissance onwards, you've got King James's Demonology, you've got Baudin's, who was a French legal writer, you've got Baudin and Remy, and I think those are the three people were really looking at within an English context. So an Examiner of Witches and Demonology, rather than the Hammer of the Witches. Hammer of the Witches is incredibly important as the touchstone for the German hunts. And of course, it ripples out from Germany. From Germany, it goes to Denmark. from Denmark, King James picks up on it when he picks his bride up, and the court is going through a series of witch trials there that are convulsing. So it spreads out like dropping a particularly dark pebble in a particularly dark well to hit these shores. But while it's quotable, the Malleus isn't the be all and end all. And I think people have assumed it has a greater influence than it really did.
Thank you, John. And I think a final question to finish on and to bring it back to the three women we've been exploring today is, do we know what happened to their bodies after they were executed? And did the church treat people executed for witchcraft in a certain way? Were they denied Christian burials, for example?
Yeah, yes, they were. What happened to the three women? They were cut down at heavy tree. They were quick limed in a pit underneath the gallows with all those other people who would have been executed, and promptly forgotten about. The Heavy Tree site today you can still visit. It's got a SO garage and a bus stop about where the gallows were. That's why the women's group, active in Exeter in the 1990s, did little guerrilla actions, as they described them, and left bundles of flowers attached to the bus stop in the witch's name and all kinds of things like that to get in the local papers, but also to show that they were remembered and to bring them back to prominence. And it really worked, actually, because you wouldn't have the plaque or the other commemorations without it. So that, one of the most insidious things about the way the worst crimes are treated in early modern Europe is that it's not about just losing your physical body, it's losing your eternal body and your eternal soul. Because if in the case of Scotland or Germany you're burned, or if you're denied a Christian burial and then you're quick-limed, so you rot away to nothing effectively, how can you be resurrected on Judgment Day? That can't happen. And there was this idea, so if you've been maimed in life, if you've been a convicted criminal and you lost a hand, or your ears have been cropped off like poor old Prynne, who suffered by Charles I, on the Day of Judgment, you would appear like that. So the women were denied any chance of salvation or resurrection. That's why very often that confession is used, particularly in the continent, particularly in Germany. And we wonder why people confessed. Well, they confessed quite clearly because that enabled them to be beheaded rather than burned. So they still had a chance of resurrection. So that essentially it's a horrible procedure, because you are saying, and in an age when religion is the totality of your life, just infuses absolutely everything, to be denied that is particularly horrific. And I'll put in a last little caveat here. It also, I think, gives you an understanding into the idea of the prosecution that witches, by creating other witches, by the demonic pact, by forging that pact with the devil, they're killing their own eternal soul. So anybody who wants to kill somebody else's eternal soul is guilty of the greatest crime. So whatever happens to them, in a sense, is fair play. And while we don't hold with that today, you've got to recognise that's what people believed in 300 years ago.
Thank you so much, John. And everyone, thank you so much for your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't put all of them there to John today, but they've been fantastic. And I'll try and get you answers, everyone whose questions I haven't been able to ask today. As we said at the start, this is a book launch lecture. So if you'd like to buy John's book, which launched today, highly recommend it. You can buy it through us at the Church Conservation Trust. We'll just post a link again on the chat now. But it's £20 plus postage packaging from us. Whereas if you buy it online from certain online retailer, it's £25. And all the proceeds go to helping conserve historic churches in our care. And we've got 356 at the moment. Now, you'll be pleased to know that this was the first lecture in October, and our October series has a spooky feel about it as we near Halloween. So next week, we are joined by David Castleton, who did a lecture for us earlier this year on church curiosities. Well, he's coming back to do another lecture for us next week called British Churches, Creepy Artifacts and Spooky Tales. So do join us next Thursday for that. But the following week after, we're joined by Dr. Emma Wells, who's going to be talking to us about what remains the gory and gruesome history of medieval cults of relics. And the final October lecture is going to be a really fascinating one with Dr. Francis Young, a fellow person from Bury St Edmunds, who's going to be talking about Begone Satan, a history of the English exorcism. Now, you can find details of all of those events on our event page listing on Facebook or on our website, which is visitchurch.org.uk. But if you've got any ideas for future lunchtime lectures or any topics that you'd like us to explore, please do comment away or send us a direct message, or you can email me at digital@thecct.org.uk. And I'd really like to hear your ideas and suggestions. But once again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. If this has been your first time attending one of our lectures, please do let us know. And I hope you've had a really fantastic experience. But John, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure,
everyone,
thank you.
See you all next week, but have a great week, everybody.
Cheerio.